The next question, what did America look like? What was the country's mood in December 7th, 1941?
The mood of the country prior to the Pearl Harbor attack was one of increasing engagement with the world. I think there was an idea that we didn't want any part of resisting Hitler's worldwide ambitions when he came to power in the 30s. In 1937, Congress passed the Neutrality Act, which kept us out of the contretemps in Europe, Hitler versus England, what have you. We didn't want any part of it. But then Japan, the other Axis nation, does something rather fateful. They move on China. And the Chinese offensive, or the Japanese offensive into China, was a provocation that FDR was alive to. President Roosevelt was very much a man of the world. He appreciated, for example, the idea of the opening up of China as an American market, the Shanghai settlement, this international crossroads he saw as the way of the future. And the idea of preserving this expansion of human freedom, of open markets, appealed to him on a kind of a visceral level, I think. And so as Japan pushes its luck, as it were, in China, you see the opinion polling in America shifting in favor of intervention, and even in favor of the type of intervention that could be seen as likely to lead to war.
Absolutely. There's I think a cultural subtext to that as well that has an awful lot to do with who we are as a religious people, because there was a great understanding and appreciation of the affront of the Japanese military against missionaries working in China. And there were missionaries all over China that were trying hard to help those people in the face of a frontal assault by an advanced military, and their stories were being told from the pulpits all over this land and carried forward, and also on the public relations side, frequently being pushed forward by the Luce family and the Time Life, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek, I believe, was featured on the cover of Life magazine more during World War II than almost anybody else, because they were pushing the affront of the Chinese people very strongly in the media that way. But I think those two aspects of religion and the PR aspect of it certainly also help sway people towards a strong belief in trying to help the poor Chinese people under this Japanese assault.
Right. So the Pearl Harbor attack is sort of a historical marker. We have the before and we have the after, and nothing was ever the same. The nature of the U.S. military prior to Pearl Harbor, you had enlistees who were motivated by economic reasons to become military men. They were fleeing Dust Bowl farms in favor of a regular paycheck, a place to lay their head, and 3 meals a day, things that weren't available at home. The military was in fact quite small prior to the Pearl Harbor attack. We had less than 500,000 men under arms in all 3 services. The Navy was 161,000 men in 1940. So the idea of freeing the world from this worldwide Axis offensive was a rather fanciful one, given the means we had to wage war prior to the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, there was a mobilization underway. President Roosevelt, recognizing the public opinion polling in favor of defending China, ramped up war production, starting in about 1939-40, I guess. 39, yeah. You start to see, the plans for these spectacular battleships, the South Dakota class, for example, the Essex class aircraft carriers. There was some foresight involved in their design and their authorization. The authorization, these ships were laid down 1940, 41 in many cases, with the idea that war was likely to come. And again, the Gallup polls are so revealing. You see February 1941, this is almost a year prior to the war. Do you think the United States should risk war with Japan if necessary in order to keep Japan from taking the Dutch East Indies and Singapore? Now, what on earth would a self-respecting American care about the Dutch East Indies or Singapore? On their face, these are British colonial possessions, Dutch colonial possessions, but this idea that Japan was doing something offensive to world order, offensive to human dignity, starts to register with the American people early, well prior to the Pearl Harbor attack. So the percentage saying yes to that question, should we risk war to save these far-flung foreign crown possessions, 39%. 6 months later, in August of 41, should the U.S. take steps to keep Japan from becoming more powerful, even if it means risking a war with Japan? This is 6 months after that, the first poll, 70% say yes in August of 1941. So the writing is on the wall. These countries are on a path to a shooting war, really, and all we're waiting for is a provocation. Japan does not play these numbers very well because, if they had a chance of getting away with seizing these territories without, running afoul of this massive sleeping giant, they might have avoided attacking Pearl Harbor in the first place. They might have attacked the Philippines, they might have attacked Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Singapore, and challenged the British to come out and fight halfway across the world, but they would have left the Americans alone if they were smart. This is the beauty of hindsight. But the writing was on the wall. And so with this writing on the wall, I don't know if they read Gallup polls in Tokyo, but if they did, they certainly didn't care much what they meant. And so Pearl Harbor, in that sense, was a huge blunder. A huge blunder.
No question about it. In context, there's a couple things going on both sides of the world at that time, and as during those 2 years, as Japan faithfully determines to move beyond Manchuria and move down into China in the late 30s, 37. Meanwhile, at the same time, 2 years later, Hitler reverses course and decides to attack Russia. I think geographically that's profound because both of these efforts by the Germans into Russia and the Japanese into China were eventually defeated by a combination of the people and the land. And the scale of the logistics required to maintain the effort was very, very difficult. And basically, by Pearl Harbor and shortly thereafter, Japan was basically at a stalemate, not moving forward hardly at all in China, and had 1.5 million soldiers tied up trying to do so, and not having any success at all. And that's when they began turning to the Dutch East Indies and the other places to try to, in Indochina, to try to get more raw materials to keep the war effort going. One point about this, though, the historians frequently will talk about the buildup of the Japanese arsenal and the effort towards Pearl Harbor as being something that was born of necessity after Roosevelt, to hinder their efforts in China, began sealing them off from having access to our raw materials, our steel, our oil particularly, and Japan needed those resources to keep moving forward. And so that was the reason they continued to advance. That certainly is true, but there are aspects that you've illuminated very well in your book to the Japanese military psyche going back to the early part of the 20th century as an ethos of military advance that certainly played a role in their zeal for moving forward and advancing into an advanced nation. Their goal really was to kick all the Westerners out of Asia and to have control of all of those places, from the Dutch, from the British, and from us. And they named this greater thing the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And that was their title for a thing that they titled Asia for Asians, and they saw themselves as the guiding light nation that would control all of Asia and kick all the Western influences out. And that was underneath all of this from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. That's right. When Japan beat the Russians in the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, they realized the prestige that could come from becoming a world military power. And they looked to two countries to kind of guide them on that path. The Japanese Navy looked to Britain How can Japan develop a navy that will allow it to project power across the Pacific? They're an island nation, they're an oceanic theater, therefore they need a navy in order not only to defend the home islands, but to project power and realize the ambitions that Joe just mentioned, the Greater East Asian Prosperity Sphere. So they looked to England. They looked to England for guidance in developing a corps of naval officers, to develop a tradition of leadership, enlisted leadership, and so on. They also looked to Britain for guidance in producing battleships, cruisers, and so forth. These early Japanese battleships that were, raged across the Pacific early in the war were British built. The Congo, famous for any number of battles, was built in a British yard to Japanese designs executed by British shipbuilders. And so that's their Navy's inspiration, was the Great Royal Navy, 19th century, dominant all across the world. The Japanese army looked to Germany, and so we had a different culture developing on the side of the army within Japan, much more militaristic, much more severe in its culture, and it will be the Japanese army whose high officials, kind of high officers, the general staff, saddles up to Tojo and concocts this ambition to kind of spring an offensive upon the entire hemisphere, concurrent with the Pearl Harbor attack. And so this is what we're part of. I think I'm not sure how alive Americans were to the designs of Tokyo, but you see the war warnings coming through 1941. You see evidence, you see a certain awareness on the part of the Navy. We're expecting hostilities to break at any moment. And there's certainly a desire on the part of President Roosevelt to engage America in this worldwide struggle, mainly against Hitler. We have the Lend-Lease program going. He's very much sympathetic to the plight of the Brits in battle against Hitler's air forces in the Battle of Britain. And so Churchill and Roosevelt become brothers in arms long before the fighting actually enables our military to engage in hostilities.
No question about that friendship between those two men and how profound it was in influencing the combined fight as we move forward to try to help Great Britain. And I think our nation during that time, those last 4 years before Pearl Harbor, was truly shocked by what happened as Germany advanced across Europe. And after they captured France, it really was a wake-up call that all of Europe could fall. And Great Britain holding out mightily against the onslaught of the horde air assault on Great Britain. It was damaging to, I think, a lot of people to think about friends and families from our mother country suffering under that kind of an assault. And I think part of the challenge we have, and everybody facing this fight at the time had, was understanding that Europe was our birth nation, but the fact is that it looked like we were going to be facing this dual combat on both sides of the world, and if it came to that, it would be very difficult. And of all the things dealing with Germany, before we get entirely off of that, and Japan, that I find profoundly interesting is, here we have two nations that both of them have a spirit and a mentality that they are individually, racially superior to every other nation as a people. And how they became allies is always a curious fact to me, when they both consider themselves so superior to everybody else. That's a curious fact to think about. So
it might have gone differently if they were actual neighbors.
Well, and also they did have the option of doing what they did, and simply dividing the world in half and choosing their sphere of influence. That didn't compete with each other.
That's right.
They weren't deciding with how they're going to chew up the United States, as far as I know that I ever saw a plan for. But we do for sure have plans the Japanese had for attacking the United States. So that was certainly in their mindset.